I am Alana Bloom, the Senior Director of Community Response at Jewish Women International. In honor of Immigrant Heritage Month, today's workshop is going to be on immigration and men and boys of faith in VAWA crimes prevention. We are joined today by Suni Kim of Korean American Family Services, Sandy Ovalle of Sojourners, and Heather Kwok of World Relief. So the objective for today's workshops are to understand the challenges of immigrant survivors in the U.S. immigration service system and the skills necessary to support immigrant survivors, to explore the challenges faced by immigrant men and boys and culturally sensitive approaches to addressing their needs, and to examine the role of faith communities in this work. I'm very excited to turn it over to Suni, Sandy, and Heather.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you. My name is Sandy Ovalle. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Mobilizing at Sojourners. And I'll let our two co-presenters introduce themselves. Sunny?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sunny Kim. I'm a Gender-Based Violence Program Director at KFAM, Korean American Family Services. We are culturally specific social organizations based in Los Angeles, California. Thank you. Heather?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Heather Kwok. I'm the Office Director at World Relief in Southern California. We have two offices, one in Orange County and one in San Diego. I'm also an accredited Department of Justice representative where I practice immigration law. Our focus here is immigration legal services and provide case management for newly arrived immigrants. It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with Sojourners, we're a faith-based organization serving at a national level in advocacy programs, including immigration and advocating against violence in all of its forms. So we'll get started today. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the experiences of immigrants. And as we get started, I want to say that the immigrant experience, if you will, cannot be singled down to just one experience, that it's not a monolithical experience. So we'll give some generalizations in here, but we are aware too that experiences are marked by the social constructs of race, gender, the classism that exists in how people migrate, and all of the systems that people encounter. So we want to make sure that that is known from the get-go. But we'll walk through those experiences, and then we'll do a little bit of an overview of tools within the system, the immigration system, to help those survivors of violence to obtain immigration benefits. So starting with the experience of immigrants, we'll start with the social cultural experience. And so some of what you may imagine as someone comes into a new country is that there will be language and cultural barriers that make survivors increasingly challenging to be able to express their experiences or to be able to access resources. Even resources are not available in some of the languages that are needed, and with the contextualization for culture that are needed. There are also issues as far as their status with documentation. A lot of benefits in these countries are tied to your status, to you being able to prove that the US government has recognized you as an immigrant in this country and that you have paperwork that allows you to access certain benefits, including some of the social benefits like unemployment and others. Many of us come from countries where the government wasn't the friendliest to immigrants, where the government punished people for expressing their opinions or for loving who they want to love, or for many other reasons. And so being able to be themselves in their countries was not safe to participate in the system. And so there is an inherent distrust of many systems because of the experiences that have happened and because of how this country too has a racialized application to their systems. And so there is that dynamic going on when immigrants enter this country. And of course, the experiences of discrimination that immigrants experience as well Again, this can be very different from different races, right? We know that Black immigrants can have a greater burden in this, can experience a greater burden due to the racism that is inherent in many of the ways in which the society functions. We know too that gender minorities, transgender people are also at greater risk when they migrate into this country and when they seek benefits. There are biases within the systems that we inhabit that do not favor these populations. So this is some of the sociocultural experiences that immigrants have. And Sunny, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. Just to add a little bit about our survivors, immigrant survivors' social cultural experiences, that years ago, there was a huge fear within our community about the fear of deportation. There are a lot of people, undocumented folks, who were actually very afraid to come out when it comes to, even though they're the victims, because of their status. Because what if I report my violence to law enforcement, but I'm the one who gets deported? There's a lot of fears around it. And not just only that, there are a lot of stereotypes about law enforcement as well, so that even though I'm a victim, I'm a survivor, I still, I feel very hesitant to report and come out because I am afraid of law enforcement. That's a general comments that we get from our survivors. I feel very, we do have immigrant survivors coming, and sometimes they do ask us to be with them and provide emotional support to them when they do communicate with law enforcement, just because they are so fearful to even talk to them. So they feel like they have to have some type of emotional support when they do provide some type of testimony or information or report to the police officers. So there are a lot of social cultural experience that are immigrant and an experience that immigrant survivors do have is a little different from non-immigrant survivors and non-immigrant families.
And if I may add to that, I think part of what I've seen is that when there's domestic violence between a partnership, that the partner who has the most access to the English language has a lot of benefit. And if that person is a perpetrator, what we have experienced is that, sometimes stories get twisted when police comes, and it's just due to the language access, right? And so then oftentimes the victims tend to be blamed for their experience instead of having access to the fullness of the support that exists. So echo what you said, Sunny.
Thank you, Sandy. So we're going to go to the next slide, which is psychological experience. So as we briefly talked about all the social and cultural hardships that immigrants experience, these hardships do bring emotional and psychological hardships and a lot of stress to immigrant families. They could think like, I came to America thinking that my life would be so much better, but my life in real life is so hard and challenging and different from what I have expected. My family's in home country think that I live my best life in America, fulfilling my American dreams, but I can't even tell them how hard it is to live as an immigrant. That this is a lot of this is something that I hear a lot from immigrant families. On top of it, the family dynamic shifts very significantly because first, immigrant children adapt to American culture. And so there is a cultural difference between parents and children, which sometimes bring tension and conflicts. The immigrant parents can't understand their children, and their children can't understand their parents and do not agree with the way their parents think and function and discipline their children. Sometimes these conflicts get really bad, and oftentimes child protective services get involved for child abuse or neglect. What I saw a lot from our community is around physical punishment. In our KFAM, Korean American Family Services, we do provide services for to Korean immigrant families. And in our community, physical punishment is considered and seen as a parent's way of showing love by teaching their children how to behave. And that is not the case here. So also Korean parents, they do talk a lot about how to behave to their children. And actually they do identify themselves with their children. So a lot of Korean American children that I saw share that they felt very controlled by their parents. Like 10 out of 10 children. They did share that they are being controlled by their parents and they are being abused by their parents. So for parents, it is the love, but for children, it is the abuse. Like this, immigrant families do experience significant shift with their family dynamics. And also one thing that I also wanted to share about is model minority myth. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with this term, but this myth is prevalent in API immigrant families, and it does characterize Asian American as polite, law-abiding group who have achieved a higher level of success than general population. And these type of beliefs really prevent survivors from seeking for help, because me reporting violence and me telling other people that our families my family do have problem, it means that our family is seen as not perfect. And it is not what I want. That is not the stereotype that we have. So in order to keep that standard and to make sure that our family is perfect and become a perfect, model for other families, a lot of survivors and families feel very hesitant to even share that they do have problems. So these are some psychological hardships that immigrant families experience. Sandy, do you have any comment to share?
I think I would add, there is something about the way that families and communities are structured, particularly for those that come from global majority cultures. The idea of collectivism and belonging to a group is a lot stronger than for some of the Western European and primarily Anglo-Saxon folks in Western societies that are more individualistic. The US tends to be a highly individualistic place where our rights, our own individual experience is validated. Whereas many of the global majority cultures are more on the collective side of things, right? And so we are a group. And while there's a lot of benefits in being a collective society and being able to solve problems more in that level, it can also create some diminishing of the personal experience or the individual experience. And so it is a fine balance for immigrants and for those that are navigating between collective and individualistic cultures to be able to find the validation of both things. Because otherwise, in a collective environment, what can happen is a lot of gaslighting of an experience, non-validation of an experience, and the fear of coming out and being separated from the collective, coming out with your experiences of violence or coming out with your survivor experiences and being separated from the rest of the community as a great loss. And so for those that are providers, it is important to work in many ways with whole communities to keep people as safely as possible connected to the community and to help communities restore that this is not just a one individual experience, but it's experiences of how do we heal together.
Thank you. Okay, so then what it is like to live as an immigrant man. So first of all, a lot of immigrant men do experience a burden to support their families. And yet their options are very limited because of language and cultural differences. For immigrant men with limited English proficiency, they do have to get a job that doesn't really require fluent English. Also, if you do not have working visa, you need to get a job that can pay you under the table. And usually you are going to be treated really badly or even paid even less than a minimum wage. Of course, if you have a well-paying career, such as engineers and doctors, it might be a little different, but they're usually, I mean, immigrant men, they are usually stuck with jobs they do not pay enough to support their families. As this, this issue does lead immigrant wives to engage in economic activities for extra income and money to support their families. And this gives a little more power to immigrant wives, which is often seen as a threat to husband. So there's a little role shift that our immigrant men experience as a husband, because I mean there used to be a support. I mean the role of control and with power, but now as their wives do engage in make some incomes and engage in economic activities, their role shifts and they have to share the power. And also immigrant man does experience role change as a father as well, because immigrant children, they do get power as they get more familiar with U.S. system. A lot of times, immigrant children are expected to take some adult responsibilities because of language. For example, they do have to make important calls behalf of their parents because their parents can't speak English, or even provide translation for their parents. And this actually give a lot of power and burden to their children at the same time. When we even have a domestic violence cases, we sometimes we do see their children translating everything their survivors or their abusers have to tell, because they are the only family member that could speak English, right? So like this, the immigrant men, they do experience a role shift as a husband and father. And with all these experiences and stress and the hardships that immigrant men have in their community, now they feel like they have lost control in their lives. And sometimes they actually try to gain the sense of control by behaving violently at home. So there are a lot of complexity and intersectionality that we have to think about when addressing gender-based violence happening in immigrant families. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just talk a little bit about the role of socialization in men. And so how men have been socialized in many of these immigrant communities to not express their feelings, to be seen as a strong male person. There's a socialization to also be in competition with other men and to not show vulnerability. And so providers can often facilitate groups that invite men into vulnerable spaces with other men, that invite men to be in collaboration versus being in competition, to prevent the toxic masculinity that can happen in many spaces out of the socialization and expectations that we have for men to perform a certain role. And so being able to provide brave and safe enough spaces for men to be able to receive the love that they need, to be able to express the feels that they have, and to do it in a way that that invites others. I don't have all the answers on that, but in a way that invites men to do that, right? Like obviously the first time that you bring someone that's not used to share their feelings is not going to work, right? And so how do we promote camaraderie and promote environments where slowly we can go a little bit more deeply into being able to be more vulnerable and to be okay to express the places where we hurt, the places where we where it seems like we're not performing, et cetera, et cetera. So just given that as providers, how do we foster circles of men that help address some of the toxic masculinity that is expected to be performed in these environments? So we're going to move on to the challenges that are faced by immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. And so first, we want to talk about the legal complexities and barriers. It is difficult to know what legal recourses you have. Sometimes the way in which we set up our systems, it's so difficult to know where do you start, and unless there is someone that has gone through that and can guide you through some of it, it can be very difficult. And so organizations like yours become really key, and the presence of the community becomes really key to be able for people to know that there are legal venues to pursue and that there are protections that are available to survivors. Being able to make the links and build trust before any of the violence ensues is key and critical, so that people have what they need if in case something happens. And education around like even what constitutes gender-based violence is critical. In many of our communities, sometimes certain things that were okay in other parts of the world or that were not criticized in other parts of the world are and constitute grounds to qualify for gender-based violence here. And so having some of that education and having some of build trust of, if I'm going to step forward with this experience, what is on the other side for me to be able to do that? So a lot of this puts the burden in providers and community members to be able to have those educational meetings, to build that trust so that we can prevent this and so that people are educated about the legal recourses available to there. There's also cultural and linguistic challenges in the context of gender-based violence. We talked a little bit about that, but I'm going to say that sometimes we assume as providers and legal systems as well, assume, for example, with Latina immigrants that everyone speaks Spanish, right? And yet we have so many indigenous immigrants that come through Latin American countries as well, that when they enter into court systems, encounter police systems, et cetera, police departments, there is not access to their languages. And so the good thing about where we live is that language access is guaranteed, that it's a right, and so that we can request to have that available to us. But people need to know that. And that helps people fight their battles better. There's economic vulnerability exacerbated by abuse, and we see this all the time: the withdrawing of funds, the closing of accounts, and access to these places, the exploitation, the financial exploitation of not letting a partner work, not letting a partner enter into a space where they can be economically self-sufficient, and then also being gaslit by their inability or so-called inability to handle their finances, right? So classes that give access to all folks in the community to know how to manage finances, to know how to access financial means are also helpful. Lack of resources to survivors, we've spoken around that. Status issues affecting survivors' ability to seek help. Oftentimes, folks who are undocumented fear for their lives, fear getting into a space where if they come out, their undocumented status will come and turn against them, where they could be deported, they could be separated from their children, where something may happen. And so they rather endure or they rather not come out because the status seems to they're fearful that it may come back to them. There's also threats oftentimes in marriages or partner relationships where when there's a mixed status family where one partner has the documents and has the status in the US and the other is not, there's all these threats, right? Like, you leave me, you will never be able to fix your immigration status. You will never have access to these. So there could be a lot of manipulation to that. And so that is why in a minute, I'm really excited to be able to talk about what is available for those that don't have status to be able to obtain certain protections and benefits. Isolation and lack of support, of community support for survivors. Yes, it can be deeply shaming to be experiencing a situation like this, and to be able to come out and find others that either have gone through it or who understand and can be supportive of the choices that one is making is key. And so I think that that's where providers and the circles that people lead are so key and critical to make those available. Cindy, I'll let you speak more into communication barriers, family dynamic, or anything else that you see in here.
Thank you. And actually, I think we could go to the next slide if that's okay with Sandy, because
Yeah.
next slide actually do.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I could, yeah. because this slide actually do some our previous slide, previous slide. So, I mean, the impact of immigration on violence is lack of resources. I mean, Sandy shared a lot. So I'm not gonna go too much details here, but lack of resources, I mean, there are not a lot of resources for immigrant survivors. While there are resources available for survivors in general, but these resources are not available in different languages. It really depends on where you live as well, but there are a lack of culturally tailored resources for immigrant survivors. For example, in LA County, there's a DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, and there is a APP unit that is like a language specific unit for API families. And in this unit, they only provide 7 to 8 languages. LA County, there's so many different API families, and yet the Child Protective Services do only provide 7 to 8 API languages. It really shows how much we need extra support with languages for immigrant survivors. And shame and guilt. Shame and guilt is something that we see a lot from GBV survivors, but this is also a huge barrier for immigrant survivors as well. It can be because in some culture and countries, they give a complete. Thank you, Sandy. Over 273 languages are spoken in LA alone. So that's definitely not enough. Because I mean, in some cultures and countries, they do give a complete power to men and see gender-based as not existent. So there are a lot of shame and guilt involved with on violence. And gender roles, a lot of immigrant communities do have fixed gender role. I mean, men need to be this and women need to be that, and this gender roles ultimately do justify gender-based violence, and these fixed gender role is very toxic, and it does impact immigrant survivor very significantly. Poverty status issue, I think Sandy shared enough, but status is actually a very huge deal for immigrant survivors. For first, lack of resources, and second, fear of system and deportation. So especially if they're undocumented. So a lot of immigrant survivors do feel hesitant to seek for services and report the violence. The isolation, a lot of immigration families do not have families in America, putting survivors in a very dangerous place where there's no one to ask for support. A lot of immigrant families, I'm not saying that a lot, some immigrant families, how their partner usually look like is that one partner is very familiar with the US system. They're usually born, or not born, but raised in the America, and when another partner is from a specific country, and so they are not really familiar with system, they do not really speak the language, and this automatically puts one partner in power position. So the immigrant survivors with limited resources and limited support from the communities and family support, it could be really dangerous for survivors because of the isolation.
So with that, we'll talk about some of the tools that are necessary for supporting immigrant survivors. And so we are going to talk through the ones listed here: understanding the U.S. immigration system, advocacy and legal support, culturally sensitive approaches, connecting survivors to community, and involving immigrant social service providers. So in order to begin some of the benefits that are available to survivors, I want to pass it on to Heather Kwok with World Relief. And as she begins, I want to remind you that we're going to talk about some legal content in here, but that this should not be constituted legal advice, but rather that this is a generalized presentation on recourses available to immigration. So Heather, take it on from here. And you should have a control of your slides at the bottom. Let me know if you're not able to see that.
Oh,
yep.
I just tested it. Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much, Suni and Sandy. Close to home information that was shared today. So thank you for that. And also just highlighting the intricacies and the challenges and many barriers that immigrants face as they navigate different agencies, different benefits as survivors. I'm going to share briefly, again, it's not constituting legal advice, it's more informational. As you potentially work with folks or your clients or patients or what have you in your sector, or you come across or that may be undocumented or have questions around their immigration status, and maybe some things that you can look out for so as you provide resources and referrals to legal service providers like World Relief. So I'm going to be sharing around immigration benefits for survivors of domestic violence and other certain crimes. I'm going to focus mainly around you and VAWA. However, just want to also mention T non-immigrant status as well, as there are aspects of that, and potentially you have clients that may benefit from this immigration route. So to start, we call it VAWA. It's an acronym, Violence Against Women Act. However, it's not specific to just women. VAWA was enacted in 1994. It originated with the goal of preventing and responding to crime survivors, specifically for women at that time. However, like I said, it's not specific to just women. Men are also survivors of domestic violence and other serious crimes. The goals when it was enacted of VAWA was to provide enhanced investigations and prosecutions of sex offenses and provide a number of grant programs for nonprofits just like us to provide resources for survivors. And it also established immigration provisions, which we'll be talking about today. So specifically VAWA. VAWA is an immigration benefit that one may be able to pursue towards the pathway of citizenship. I'm going to give a real quick, as a practitioner, it's hard for me to simplify this, but I will try my best. And if you have any immigration specific questions, you can private message me and I'll try my best, but might not be the specific, if you have a specific question you want to ask. VAWA allows an abused spouse or child of a US citizen or lawful permanent resident, or we call a green card holder, or an abused parent of a US citizen, not lawful permanent resident, abused parent of a US citizen to self-petition for status in the United States. Additionally, potentially to receive employment authorization, access to public benefits like social services, and the possibility of LPR status or green card status, which then leads to citizenship. As a survivor that you're pursuing this benefit, the abuser, in this case, a spouse or parent, does not need to be part of your filing, your immigration paperwork. So they don't need to know that you're doing this. They don't need to sign it. I'm going to give you a very simplified case scenario or fact pattern that we typically see. I'm an undocumented individual. I am with an American partner, US citizen, and I've been a victim of domestic violence for years, let's say. And typically, as somebody without status, married to a citizen, you take the path to do a family petition and see and try to get a green card through that typical route. However, in the case where you're a victim of a crime or a spousal battery, and this is one of the tools or manipulation tools that the abuser would use, that I see on all my cases, they would use status as a way to control their partner. And instead of doing the petition together and trying to get that green card for their spouse, they use that to, I'm going to call ICE, or if you don't do X, Y, and Z, and a way to control the spouse. And so through much advocacy, so that the spouse who would typically be on a pathway to citizenship, but has an unwilling or abusive partner, would do it on their own and do a self-petition. So then I would petition on my own, do an immigration form on my own, potentially my child as well, and as a derivative, and pursue that pathway to get status in the United States, separate from typically my spouse. Another case is if you're an abused parent. So if I have a child who's a US citizen, so only US citizen children, not green card holder, and they're over 21, and they are abusing me, the parent, I may be able to also self-petition on a route to get lawful status. So I mentioned a few already. So these are the typical folks: the abused spouse of a US citizen and lawful permanent resident. So if you identify an undocumented individual who's married to a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident green card holder and has been a victim of domestic violence and is trying to figure out how to get status, VAWA is something that I would recommend getting a consultation on. If you are a child meaning under 21, unmarried, of a US citizen or green card holder, same, I would also see if this would be a potential route for that child. And then the last one is the parent of a US citizen, son or daughter who's over 21 years or older, to pursue a benefit through VAWA. The VAWA self-petitioner must demonstrate that they have a qualifying relationship, which we just went over. In the case that I'm married to a US citizen abuser and we get a divorce, a legal divorce, the VAWA self-petitioner can still file as long as it's within the 2 years of the divorce. Okay, I'm just going to repeat that again. This is information that most people don't know. And so because there's a timeline on this, is very crucial. I've seen folks who come to me 10 years later. It's like, oh, we could have done VAWA, but we're going to do a U visa instead. And we'll go over the U visa. You must file within that 2-year window of divorce. 2, you were subjected to battery or extreme cruelty by a US citizen. That language, battery, extreme cruelty, is used in the INA. And so that's why I'm just reusing that again. By the US citizen or LPR abuser, in the case of a child or spouse. Reside or resided with the abuser. The self-petitioner possesses good moral character. And in the case where your spouse abused you, married in good faith. So you also, the burden is on you as a self-petitioning spouse who was abused by their partner to show that you married in good faith. To keep it simple, really, you need to show that you didn't marry to get an immigration benefit. You married for love, essentially. Now, for processing purposes, VAWA follows the family-based procedures. So for practitioners, that would make sense. But in that, some folks can apply for a green card and this VAWA self-petition concurrently at the same time, which means that when you're filing, you can submit everything at once, VAWA application to show the abuse and relationship, along with a green card application, lawful permanent status, potentially. And as a result, you can get a green card potentially right away. However, it depends on the abusing person relationships, immigration status to determine whether or not, quote unquote, a visa is available readily and you are able to apply for the green card right away, or you may have to wait a little bit until the visa is ready for you. In that case, you would file the VAWA on its own and then the green card application separately. That might have gone too specific, but I just wanted to show you the complexities around that, and that yes, it is a potential route to a green card, some sooner than others. Just wanted to share that. So that was just, a quick snapshot on VAWA as an immigration benefit. So keep it simple. If you have a parent as a child, or I'm as a child, and you have so as a child, I have a parent that's abusive that has status, U.S. citizenship, or if your spouse has a status, green card or U.S. citizenship, and you're a victim of domestic violence, or if you're a parent of an adult U.S. citizen and has undergone battery, then potentially there's a route for VAWA. That's something I would look into as somebody who's undocumented. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about U visa. So technically it's called U non-immigrant status, but just in every day we call it a U visa. There's just a technicality, the difference. It does lead to a green card, and then ultimately it does lead to citizenship. Now it does take a long time, but for many folks, this is their only route as it is. However, I will mention at the very end, in light of Biden's executive order announcement the other day, I'm going to quickly just do a quick sharing of that, because that will be relevant to a lot of folks that we serve. The U visa and the T visa came about in 2000, and really was, especially with the U, I think it was mentioned before, many folks who are undocumented have fear of reporting crimes that were against them and fear of being deported. So any contact with any kind of law enforcement agency, there's a fear that I will be deported or somebody in my family will be impacted negatively. And so with a lot of advocacy from organizations that are present here, this came about so that there is to mitigate that fear. So if you, undocumented individual, or with exceptions, because when children are involved, have been a victim of a qualifying crime. And so the U statute lists out certain crimes. So it's not just any crime. These are the typical ones. You've been a survivor of rape, domestic violence, sexual assault, exploitation. One. Second, you've sustained significant physical and or emotional abuse because of those crimes or crimes. You possess information about the crime and you were helpful in the investigation of that crime. So something bad happened to you, it was reported, it doesn't have to be reported by you, but it was reported. But once law enforcement agency was involved, you cooperated in the investigation and catching of the perpetrator. And you're, for immigration purposes, you're admissible to the US. There's a waiver, it's a very generous waiver, which means that you could have certain immigration crimes and or immigration violations that typically would make you ineligible to pursue an immigration benefit. There is a perdon or waiver typically that can override that because the U visa is very discretionary as long as you show a lot of positive equities. So the U visa is immigration relief for undocumented individuals who, one, victim of a certain crime, two, sustained injuries due to that, physical and or mental, three, cooperated in the investigation and continues to be available to cooperate in the investigation and or prosecution of the perpetrator. And so to keep it simple, those are the typical requirements or eligibility factors. So if you identify somebody who's undocumented and has been a victim of one of these qualifying crimes that were listed, and there's more specific to this, but these are the most common ones, then potentially when you refer them, oh, hey, maybe you should look into a U visa. Now, the biggest difference between the U visa and VAWA is the status of the abuser. So in the case of a U visa and your partner, let's say your husband is the abuser, but your husband has no immigration status, is not a US citizen, nor is a lawful permanent resident, you would not be able to do the VAWA. You would probably pursue the U. Or if you were, a common one is I was working at the gas station and then somebody came in and assaulted me and put a gun to my head to rob me. The complete stranger. This would be like a felonious assault, and this would be a U visa, for example. Okay, I'm just going to move on. The benefits of youth status. It's given for you for up to 4 years, which you may be able to extend. But typically you get it for 4 years. It gives you employment authorization. It gives you deferred action, which is protection from deportation. You have the option to apply for a travel document. It's called advanced parole. And additionally, you may be able to add several family members who are also undocumented in your application. You are the principal applicant. I will add my undocumented child. I will add my potentially, if there's children, and I don't want to get too complicated, but children who are US citizens, who are underage and maybe were a victim of sexual assault. This is a common one we do see. So US citizen children, 7 years old, let's say, was a survivor of sexual assault. The mother, who's undocumented, was the one to cooperate with law enforcement, child protective services, all of that, because that child is incapacitated from engaging in those conversations because of her age. And so the undocumented parent then turns into the indirect victim, and then turns into the principal applicant. And then the mom is the one pursuing the benefit because that child is already an American. But the actual crimes were against the child. You get youth status for 4 years. And then within that 4 years, and 3 years have passed, you apply for green card status, otherwise eligible. You're still subject to all the specifics of lawful permanent residence eligibility. The government sets the U visa cap. And so the U visa cap as is has been for 10,000. So every year, the USCIS only issues up to 10,000 U statuses. As a result, there's a very long wait list, over 200,000 backlog. As of June 4th, 2021, in response to the backlog, USCIS implemented a process called bona fide determination, which we call BFDs, which means that folks who are waiting at some point, and it's still kind of complicated right now, how they're rolling it out, USCIS, you would essentially get a work permit and deferred action, protection for deportation, while you're waiting for adjudication on your U visa application. In certain states, like California, you may be eligible for some state benefits and or federal. I think it's just very state specific, just by filing your U visa. And that goes for VAWA as well. VAWA, there's something called prima facie, which is like a pre-approval, which if you show that to a social service agency, you may be eligible for certain benefits that you would not otherwise be eligible for being completely undocumented. So you would want to look into that. So just by a U visa receipt notice from USCIS, you may be eligible for certain benefits in your state. Again, I'm just emphasizing the U processing time because it is really long. I started doing U visas and became the main U visa practitioner in our office in 2016. And so it wasn't until just a few years ago that we were getting decisions and work permits. And so literally 5-6 years later, I'm only able to, which is great, share with my clients, hey, we got a work permit for you, which leads to a social security number and leads to, and also the protection from deportation, which is the deferred action. So based off of USCIS, the general approximate is 15 years for U approval because there's so many stages to it and because we're subject to the 10,000 cap. After filing, approximate wait for the BFD, which is the work permit and the deferred action, is around 64 months. And everything is very case by case. We've seen some filings after a few years, they're getting the work permit. Others, add on another few years, they're getting their work permit. Then from their BFD determination to the actual decision on the U, in some seasons, I've seen it take 1 year, some 2 years. Now I'm telling folks around 3 years. Once you get the U status, you get for 4 years. And then in 3 years, within that 4 years, you apply for residency, green card. And then after 5 years, you apply for citizenship. So it is a pathway, however, very long pathway. But for folks as it is, this is their only choice if they're eligible. And I do want to quickly mention there is something called the T non-immigrant status, which also came about in 2000 as well with the U. It's called a T visa, which we say, are survivors of sex or labor trafficking. And so it doesn't necessarily have to have happened everything abroad. I've had a case here in Fresno who was sex trafficked here in California. And so the T visa has a much smaller cap and a much smaller amount of folks applying for the T visa. So if you're in a situation where it could be both, and there are many circumstances where you may be eligible for multiple benefits, immigration benefits. So say you've assessed, the legal practitioner or attorney has assessed, oh, it looks like you can do a U visa, a T visa. In that case, it's very clear. I would say do the T visa because they never meet the cap, which means that they're processed much faster than a U. So that's something you would strategize with your counsel. But T visa is if I have scenarios, a group of Filipinos were labor trafficked from Philippines, and they were able to pursue the T visa. And you're able to also add a lot of your derivatives, either here or abroad, to come in and get the T visa, which then you would apply for residency and then apply for citizenship. Similar to the U visa, it has the components of you need to cooperate with law enforcement agency as well. And so it could be the Department of Labor, it could be FBI, whatever the jurisdiction falls on, there's some level of cooperation, and and the law enforcement agency, just like a U, has to certify, which they need to sign something to confirm that, yes, these crimes did happen to this person. Yes, this person cooperated with us. They need to sign to kind of check off on that as well. And so just letting you know, because we're talking about all the different crimes. The T visa is also is not as common as the U and VAWA. However, for myself, I've had several clients pursue T visas. And my final note that I do want to mention in light of Biden's executive order that was, which I wasn't planning to mention, but I think it's crucial because in our office as well, we're ramping up to how to best provide education outreach around this. And so if it goes as planned, most likely it will be rolled out in the next few months, if it was similar to how DACA was rolled out over 12 years ago. But we don't know the specifics, okay? And so if you have individuals asking you, and I already have a bunch of folks emailing me about this, USCIS has not posted anything. So USCIS needs to post and give us instructions and more specific eligibilities around this. There's two big components to this, and those are the spouses who are married to US citizens, and you came without inspection. So that means you came without a lawful entry to the United States. And so to keep it really simple, there's already in the White House executive order announcement, they indicated that that individual had to have lived in the United States for at least 10 years, that they have been married to a US citizen as of June 17, 2024. So if you go and get married right now, it won't count, okay? It has to have been June 17, 2024. And they had entered without inspection or entered without some kind of visa, right? That's one component, and then they would be on a potential pathway to get green cards or lawful permanent residency through what we call parole in place. Parole in place is already something that's in immigration law. So typically used for spouses who are in the military or have been in the military. So I've done parole in place applications for individuals. Say I'm undocumented, I'm married to a US citizen, they've previously been honorably discharged from the military, and I have entered without inspection or an illegal entry, which then would otherwise disqualify me from getting my green card here in the United States, and I would have to do it abroad. There's a lot of fear with obviously leaving the country with no guarantee of coming back lawfully. And so parole in place, because my spouse was part of the military, allowed me, it was a mechanism for me to do my paperwork here in the United States as a spouse of somebody who was in the military. So it seems like the government is using that kind of language or existing law to expand it to folks who may have not served in the military, right? But use the mechanics of that so that they don't have to go abroad. And so that's going to impact a lot of the folks that we serve. That's one component of it. Another component of it is for folks who have DACA, or there's language around it that says dreamers, which makes it up for interpretation that it's not, it also includes non-DACA recipients, but may have fulfill certain requirements similar to those who have DACA that may be eligible for this. And you have an offer letter from an employer, and you've completed higher education, that you may be on a pathway also to for lawful status. So those are the only things we know. We know that there is no actual application platform or pipeline right now. So we want to encourage the community to be aware of notario fraud. It's very prevalent for tax preparers or just anybody, honestly, to say, hey, you want to apply for the Biden law, and they'll just whip up something and probably do a frivolous work permit application based on asylum or something like that. And so you just want to inform the community that there is no such process right now. The best we can do is be informed and be prepared. So in the event that this all does become implemented, that we're ready to apply if that fits your situation at that time. Other than that, I think that ends my presentation. Sandy.
Yeah, well, I know that you've heard a lot right now and all great information. Thank you, Heather. I think if there's a question or two, maybe we can make a pause for that so that it's not all of us talking, and then we can resume for the latter part. But I want to open up some space if folks have any questions regarding the immigration benefits that were just discussed. If not, we're going to keep moving, and then we'll come back again to we just have some more final minutes here, and then we'll keep moving. Thank you again, Heather, for these. And these immigration benefits are crucial to get people more power, to get people access to live more freely, to be able to access work that is easier, to be able to participate in our society in better ways, to have access to social benefits, and to live without less fear. Or to live with less fear, sorry, to live with less fear. So, but as we do these, there are cultural sensitivities that have to be implemented in our strategies and interventions. So among those efforts are community-based initiatives. So working with whole communities to have education around what constitutes domestic violence, and education around the benefits available to survivors of violence, and working also with communities, with those elected officials and even law enforcement, to educate them around the needs of our communities, to let them know of our language requests, to let them know of our cultural requests. So community-based initiatives are key. We also engaging immigrant men and boys in prevention and intervention. So again, those key circles where men and boys can begin to be socialized into a different kind of masculinity, a masculinity that does not demand violence from them, but a masculinity that promotes collaboration, that allows for creativity, a masculinity that invites, that loves, that is vulnerable. So helping involving men and boys in working in their own socialization is key. And then also involving them in educating other men and getting with other men around these topics. So we also want to mention that sometimes when we address survivors, we think of giving equal benefits, but equality is not what we need. What we need is equity. We think of addressing every case the same, and if we just address every case the same, that's just giving equal attention to everyone. But what we need is equity. And so equity is about giving every person what they actually need versus just giving the same to everyone. And so that means that we have to do a deeper dive into people's needs. Does a person need psychological attention? Does a person need to be connected with a legal provider, legal counsel for their benefits? Does a person need, what kind of community support do they need to be able to pull through a process of moving towards freedom and away from violence? So equity means that not everyone will get the same, but everyone will have what they need. So that's what we want to advocate for here. We also want to address the shame, guilt, and stigma of seeking help. Again, this happens a lot in those community-based conversations, town halls, etc. The reality is that we have been socialized, especially as immigrants who come into this country, to, be the perfect immigrant, the good immigrant myth, right? Like if you're just good enough, you're gonna get your things. And so there's a lot of shame and guilt in even seeking help out of fear of being perceived as a burden as opposed to as a contributor. And so reminding folks that we are people, that all of us can contribute with our gifts, and that seeking help is normal, that seeking help, that everyone can help each other, that we all contribute and we all take in a functioning society. So those are some of the cultural sensitivity strategies and interventions. And we'll move to the community-based initiatives.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. And we want to, there are four different components under culturally sensitive strategy and interventions, and we want to go a little deeper for each factor. The first is community-based initiative. So it is really important. Well, it is impossible to serve immigrant survivors without community involved. Earlier, we talked about how immigrant women do experience isolation. So it is really important to connect survivors to the community that they feel comfortable and community that they do identify themselves with. There are many areas that the community could support immigrant families and survivors. First of all, resources. There are so many resources available in the community. Once I've seen a church that was able to provide comprehensive support to survivors. Thankfully, this faith leaders were educated in our 40-hour training so that they were really knowledgeable in terms. They were aware of how they could support and what they had to do in order to serve survivors. So this church was able to identify the survivor from their congregant, and they were able to provide housing, employment, childcare, basically everything for survivors to achieve independence. So it was really impressive how this church was able to provide services just like our organization. Like I said, there are a lot of resources available in the community, so it is really important to connect survivors to the community that they do identify. When we think about during COVID, there were so many community resources available. There were a lot of CBOs, community-based organizations giving out masks and sanitizers, and churches, and a lot of community organizations were able to provide resources that our survivors could utilize. And also, we do have survivors support group where we do provide survivors some space to build relationship with one another. And what we really see from the group is that they do talk a lot about things and a lot of resources that they could share within the group. So they talk about things like where to get the cheap snacks, or which hairstylists charge you less, and things like that. So I mean, it is really, like I said, it's really important. And this and survivors could get a lot of resources from the community. Second, emotional support. Survivors definitely can receive emotional support from the community, and in order to provide emotionally safe environment and community for survivors, it is important to address victim blaming in the events. Yes, I mean, there are organizations like us that provide emotional support in many ways for survivors, but it is a different type of service, I mean, support that they get from the community. And also, community can provide learning opportunity for immigrant survivors from building a meaningful relationship to many other things, such as how to make bank account and other things. As a lot of immigrant survivors do experience lack of support and isolation, it is important for them to learn how to build a meaningful relationship. And this can lead to other meaningful learning opportunity as well. You know, right now, I just shared about making a bank account, and there's actually a reason why I did that, because we literally had a survivor who learned how to make a bank account from a friend that she made. So she didn't even know how to make bank account in US. But and this new friend that she made was able to teach her and be with her and go with her to make bank account for her. So I remember she was really happy about that. You know, so once again, it's very important to encourage survivors to be more engaged in their community. In order to work a community, it is important to identify your community or the community that survivors do identify with and build relationship with them. And also, it is important to identify the needs of the community, because a lot of times it goes with survivors' need as well. So community engagement, education, training, and outreach is really, really important when we provide services to immigrant survivors.
That's you again, Suni. I think this is you again, this slide.
Oh, okay. All right. And also engaging migrant men and boys is really important. Identify their hardships as immigrants. So and do not blame, but build partnerships. When we talk about gender-based violence, the men and boys, they do feel very threatened and blamed. So it is important to try to build the partnership with them. And in order to do that, it is, instead of just, you know, and talk about it, well, because talking about gender-based violence could be, you know, because a lot of times men are the ones who abuse, and it sometimes it feels like they are being blamed and put in the spot. So what has been very helpful for us is that to really identify their own hardships as immigrant, and also the hardships as a men and boys. So it was really helpful to do that, to really build partnership with them. And addressing cultural issues, we've been talking about toxic masculinity and the generational violence, the medias. There are so many cultural components that needs to be addressed. And it's been really helpful, because gender-based violence is heavily impacted by the cultural societal views. So it's really important to address the cultural issues as well, and talk about the healthy masculinity. A lot of men and boys, there are a lot of toxic masculinity and the stereotypes about being a man, being aggressive, being a dominant, and things like that. And it's been really beneficial to really talk about what healthy masculinity looks like. And it's been really, and providing education around that has been really helpful to build a partnership with men and boys. And provide resources. There are a lot of resources available for immigrant men and boys in the community. So it's important to provide resources as well and connect them to community as well. And also help building peer support group. It has been really beneficial. Sandy briefly talked about men not being able to express their feelings. It's really, they feel really hesitant to be vulnerable. And what we saw was helpful was that if they see someone else's doing that, they can also learn from them how to be vulnerable and how to and how to be emotional and express their emotions. And it was really helpful for us to kind of build a support group for them so that they could learn from one another and work as a family. A lot of communities, in a lot of communities, the value of family is so important. So it has been really beneficial for us to really talk about family and then also provide resources that could benefit the family as a whole instead of like survivors or men and boys and women and you know, as instead of like it's a individual support as well. Oops, sorry.
So we talked a little bit about shame. Sorry.
I'm so sorry.
A little bit about equality and equity. So we've already mentioned some of what this means. And so to give an example on this, you know, sometimes you may have people that have very similar circumstances that may come from a partner that is a perpetrator and are seeking abuse. What you may not know is that one of them has immigration status versus the other doesn't, right? And so while equality may mean like, oh, everyone gets to go through our support group, equity would mean that I would also see if the group is welcoming to immigrants, if the group is made up of people that know that, or if I need to seek other opportunities for this person to join because they're an immigrant, if I need to find a different kind of group. It may also mean that the immigrant survivor will need maybe access to immigration benefits, etc. So you may end up working a little bit more on a case that has an immigrant survivor versus a non-immigrant survivor. That is because we want to give equity, give everyone what they need so that they can be successful. So.
Yes. Shame, guilt, and stigma. It's really important when providing services to immigrant survivors. It's really important to address shame, guilt, and stigma. The reason why shame and guilt feels huge in immigrant survivors is because oftentimes they identify with a community that is a lot smaller. For example, like, you know, like as I shared, we do provide services to Korean immigrant survivors, and our survivors often tell us that they were hesitant to call us and ask for services because they were afraid to be identified as survivors in the community. And they feel like just because our Korean immigrant community is so small, just me going to the counseling center and receiving services, it could mean that they are disclosing their identity, right? And in fact, as I worked at KFAM as an advocate as well, I saw a lot of familiar faces. And that's how small our community is. LA it's a melting pot. I mean, we have a lot of different communities in LA, and we think that in LA County there's huge Korean community, and yet our community is still very small and very vulnerable, and our survivors become very vulnerable when they're engaged in the community that is a lot smaller. And also cultural stigma related to gender-based violence and victim blaming is something that we always have to remember. So it is important to address that. And this is why education is so important. And also it's important to identify and address the sense of guilt that immigrant survivors do have. You know, immigrant survivors do feel guilty because of many reasons. If they report the violence, this could mean deportation to them, whether it is true or not. That's how they feel like, how they think. Also, the criminal record could result in limited job opportunity and a hardship to get certain visa and status for perpetrators. And oftentimes survivors blame themselves for these consequences. What about kids? Survivors feel guilty for their children because gender-based violence does have a significant impact on children. And reporting domestic violence could even mean losing a father figure for children. For immigrant families without a lot of family members living in America, family relationship could mean a lot. And a lot of immigrant survivors decide to sacrifice their own safety to keep their family together. So, for example, we do hear a lot of, I can't make my kid's father go to jail. There's no one else that could look after my kids, and there's no one else who can make money for our family. These things are the ones that we hear a lot from our survivors. Shame for not making it. I've already shared a little about this, so I'm not going to go too much details, but like I said, our family moved here so that we could live an American dream. And did I come all the way to America just for this? There are a lot of shame around that as well. And as a result, when working with immigrant survivors, it is really important to address these psychological and emotional burdens with them. We could do that by reminding them that the consequences are not because of them reporting violence, but because of abusers' violent behaviors. And also letting them know that there are resources available for them is really important.
So we'll talk a little bit about the role of faith, and but the rest we'll talk a little bit. But as you know, actually all three of us work in faith-based organizations, and faith communities have been integral to providing support. And so as long as they have good education and theology to be able to enter into the spaces, faith communities have infrastructures that allow for better support in this. And so faith for many immigrant communities, in whatever form that is, can play a role in coping with hardship and trauma. So communities of faith become important, whether for many immigrant communities of faith are even more important because they are centers where community gathers. They are places where the community receives dignity, where the community is recognized in their dignity, right? Like we see it with many of the churches where I've been a part of, immigrant churches, where every day they say, I clean the schools where I work, but on Sundays they are the deacon. They are the person that has the power in those places and whose dignity is embraced. And so those communities of faith also serve as places where pastors for immigrant communities, and not just pastors, but faith leaders, monks, rabbis, imams, and others, also provide counsel and provide access to resources. So maintaining a good relationship with those leaders so that they know what's available in their communities is important. Addressing cultural and religious barriers to accessing services. And this is why it's important to also work with faith communities to educate them on, and this is what we've been doing all year, right? Like all year we've been having these webinars talking about how from each one of our different faith perspectives, we can talk about the dangers of violence, and how we can talk about the resources available within our own faith to fulfill a life that is dignifying for all and free of violence for all. So every faith that is represented in our consortium has provided different frameworks for how to address from a faith perspective what a violence-free environment and violence-free community could look like. And again, through the faith spaces, there is an importance for promoting positive masculinity and gender equality in those spaces. And so resources are available for these through the consortium as well. And so we've put together different resources from each one of the different faiths available to talk about this topics that can be taboo when many of our faiths, I speak for Christianity, have been, and not for all of Christianity, but I know that some of Christianity has perpetrated violence and has been the faith that has contributed to some of the gender roles that are hard. And so the consortium is here to help you find alternate frameworks that you can offer to churches and others to approach these topics from a healthy place and from a place that allows people to even go deeper into the truths of their faith that are nonviolent and peaceful faiths. So, if nothing else is there, Sunny, then I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. So in conclusion, it is understanding how culture shapes immigrants' experience is key. And identifying immigrant survivors' current situation and their needs are very important. And also know your community and what is available to support families within the community. And build relationship with faith organization is important in so many ways. So with that being said, thank you everyone for joining us for this presentation.
Yes, and if there are any questions, this would be the time in the last few minutes to hear from you before we make some announcements. Alana makes some announcements, so I'd love to hear. I know that it's been a lot. It's a 90-minute thing, so. But if anything stuck out to you or any places where you want to speak, we are here. If not, I want to thank Heather Quack, who especially joined us from World Relief, and Sunny as well. And we'll pass it back to you, to Elena.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And Sunny, do you want to put your emails into the chat just in case people have follow-up questions? Thank you. And I'll also post our website. So really appreciate the information, Sandy, Sunny, and Heather. This was really informative. Just so everyone knows, the recording will be available on our website. Feel free to share it with anybody who you think would benefit from today's workshop on immigration. Incredibly important information to share and to know. Our next program is on July 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's a peer-to-peer forum where you can hear from other grantees on work that they're accomplishing, and also how to adopt that work into what you guys are doing as well. And that's it. We look forward to seeing you on July 15th.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.